again, friends. It has been quite a while, but here I am back again. It's October, so it was time to fill your minds with a spooky story. Many of you find comfort in your childhood shows, but it seems some are not quite as safe as you thought. So let's delve into the tale of Squidward's suicide. I just want to start off by saying if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed, because there just isn't one. So, I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year, in 2005, for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course, most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up for the next season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty, and gathered around the screen to watch it, as you do. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with the phony, often sometimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bivalve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles, so when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think it was more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it, the happy-go-lucky music plays as normal, and the story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, as he always did in the episodes. He was hitting a few sour notes, like normal, and we hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and then Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down, as, you know, it was the night of his concert, and he needed to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy and Patrick. The bubble splash screen comes up, and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things... they started to seem a little off. While playing, a few frames repeated themselves, but the sound didn't. At this point, sound is synced up with animation, so yes, that's not a common error. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that's common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame and looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob center frame, and he, too, is booing. Very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing, though. What is odd is everyone had these hyper-realistic eyes. They're very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than the CGI would usually use. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question it. I guess we didn't really think how it might appeal to kids? We weren't really the target audience. The shot goes to Squidward sitting at the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is the night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is at this point, there's no sound. Like, literally, no sound. There was nothing. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were just turned off. Though their status showed them as working perfectly on our monitors. He just sat there, blinking, in the silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob softly. He put his hands, or I guess tentacles, over his eyes and just cried quietly for a full minute. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly started growing from nothing to being barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. It was hard to describe. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face, and by slow I mean it's only barely noticeable if you look at the shots 10 seconds apart, side by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists in on itself for a split second, and then it's back to normal, like nothing happened. The wind through the trees sound, though, gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is this sound, and Squidward's sobbing. They sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, as if it was coming from just the room we were in. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second or so. You had a hard time pinning it. We watched the show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently. Something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound it frame by frame. And what we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was mangled and bloodied. One eye dangled over an upturned face, popped. He was naked down to his underwear. His stomach was crudely cut open and his entrails were lying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most unsettling part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tag or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It seemed the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but we pressed on, hoping that it was just some kind of sick joke still. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, and half his body in frame. There was now what appeared to be a blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style, not usually something we'd have for the animation. It looked as if you could touch it, and you had blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if we were part of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing became a deep baritone, lasting at longer intervals than before, and it was coming in more frequently. After 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was understandably reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew what he had to do. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach. Her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out and, well, popped. She was naked except for underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her, above another crude cut along her back. Then the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape to the first. It had choked back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. Joe resumed after that. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was just gone, like when the scene started. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in the same hyper-realism like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer, watching us. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, the most fear-inducing of all his sobbing. It was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep-voiced laughing. And this time, the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age. But this time, the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from the stomach. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator processed it. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went to the first and played them quicker. I lost it. I vomited on the floor, and the animating and the sound editors gasped at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why we had called him down here. So the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer. Full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and that deep voice said, "Do it!" And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters on the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with a force. The last 5 seconds of the episode shown were his body on the bed and his side, one eye dangling and what's left of his head on the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the heck was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind, and caused me these horrible nightmares. Frankly, I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze what happened. The analysis of the file did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches of any kind. As if the timestamp may have glitched and shown the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened. And to this day, nobody does. But there was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have something happen to me that I can't prove anything about beyond it being anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things.